Sophie was only 6, but that afternoon, outside Mercy General Hospital, she carried a fear far bigger than her tiny frame. Rain clouds gathered above her as she stood on the cold pavement, clutching her sky-blue dress with trembling fingers. Her mother, already weak from illness, could barely stay on her feet, and every shaky breath she took made Sophie's heart race faster. She tried to speak, to call for help, but her voice kept breaking under the weight of her tears. People rushed past. Cars hummed by, yet no one seemed to notice the terrified little girl, desperately pointing toward the glass doors where her mother leaned helplessly. To Sophie, the world suddenly felt impossibly big and frightening, and all she wanted was for anyone to understand how scared she was. She didn't know what would happen next, only that she couldn't lose her mother. The people standing at the hospital gate weren't doctors, nurses, or anyone trained to help. They were just 3 contractors assigned to watch the entrance during renovations. But instead of offering even a little compassion, they treated Sophie and her mother like an inconvenience. One of them leaned back carelessly, scrolling through his phone as if he couldn't hear the child's desperate pleas. Another smirked, watching the scene unfold with a cold, bored expression, while the third shrugged off Sophie's tug on his sleeve as though she were nothing more than a nuisance. Laura's knees weakened, her breath growing heavier, yet the men still refused to move, telling them to wait as if time wasn't slipping away. Sophie's panic grew with every second, realizing these adults, these supposed protectors, were choosing cruelty over kindness. Sophie's cries echoed across the sidewalk, but they were swallowed by the noise of the city. People glanced over for a moment, then quickly looked away, pretending not to see the fear in her eyes, or the way her mother struggled to stay upright. It was the kind of silence that hurts, the kind where everyone hopes someone else will step forward first. Sophie held her mother's hand tighter, feeling it grow colder, and for a moment she thought this was it, that no one was coming. But then, beneath the hum of traffic, another sound began to rise, a deep, steady rumble that didn't belong to cars or buses. The pavement vibrated under her feet as the noise grew louder, turning heads one by one. Even the men blocking the entrance paused, their smug expressions flickering with uncertainty. Something was approaching, something powerful and impossible to ignore. The motorcycles rolled to a slow, deliberate stop just a few meters away, their engines fading into a heavy silence that seemed to wrap around the entire street. Sophie turned, startled, watching as 5 riders stepped off their bikes, each one towering, weathered, and carrying an air of unspoken authority. At the front was Ryder Callan, a man whose presence felt like a wall of strength. His beard was touched with gray, his leather vest worn from years of life on the road. Yet his eyes softened the moment they met Sophie's. He crouched down to her level, letting her trembling words spill out in broken breaths. Without hesitation, without a single question, he rose and walked toward the men blocking the hospital doors. His calm footsteps carried more power than shouting ever could. Even his brothers fell into formation behind him, their silence speaking louder than words. Ryder didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. He simply stood before the men with a steady gaze that made their confidence crumble. The one in the hoodie tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat as Ryder took a single step closer. Behind him, his fellow riders stood like a silent wall, their presence alone enough to make the thugs rethink every careless choice they'd made that day. Slowly, reluctantly, the men stepped aside, no longer brave enough to hide behind arrogance. Ryder didn't waste a second. He reached for Laura, lifting her arm gently over his shoulder as if she were family. Inside the hospital, staff rushed forward the moment he crossed the threshold. Nurses appearing with stretchers and doctors calling out instructions. Sophie stayed right by her mother's side, her tiny hand gripping tighter now that hope had finally arrived. Win. The doctors finally took Laura behind the curtains of the emergency ward. Sophie waited with her heart pounding, unsure if she should smile or cry. Ryder stepped out a few minutes later, his boots quiet on the hospital floor, and before he could say a word, Sophie ran straight into his arms. She wasn't scared anymore, just overwhelmed with relief. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and told her she was braver than most grown men he'd ever met. Then, just as quietly as he had arrived, he pressed a folded $20 bill into her hand, the inked message for Mom's medicine written across it. He didn't stay to be thanked, didn't wait for recognition. He simply nodded to his brothers, and together they walked back to their bikes as the engines roared to life. Inside, nurses watched from the windows, knowing they had witnessed something rare and unforgettable.